Okay, you got it.
Okay, we're recording.
Mhm.
Hello, friends. This is going to be a shorter webinar, but about a topic which is pretty important because we've seen probably hundreds, if not thousands, of resumes at this point in our lives. And we've seen some really good resumes and we've seen some really bad resumes. And the problem with the bad resumes is that it can affect, I think, the positive view you might have of someone's candidacy, or just like your perspective, if that resume is not a good showcase of them as a person and their achievements and credentials. So we thought it'd be worth spending spending a short webinar talking about resumes for fellowship applications. We'll take questions at the end, but yeah, I guess we'll just move on. So I guess it's important to note that if you get endorsed for the Marshall and Rhodes application, we have, Lauren's chatting about Fulbright. If you get endorsed for the Rhodes and Marshall won't actually require a resume. They will require kind of this info in the context of the application. Rhodes will actually require a resume for the application. But for our internal application, we are requiring a resume. So it's important that you're giving the selection committee this view into your candidacy. So a resume is part of your argument for why you should receive a fellowship. It's you might think of this as a way of framing your experience or curating your experience for the reader in a very concise and effective way. So drawing the reader's attention to your main accomplishments and credentials as they relate to the narrative and the trajectory that you're going with in your application. So you don't want to overwhelm the reader with content where some of the more important things get lost, or you're not doing justice to those shining lights of your candidacy. So it also requires paying attention to what the fellowship is looking for to kind of inform and guide the content that you're putting on your resume. So given the fact that Marshall and Rhodes are looking for people who have cultivated and demonstrated expertise, thinking about highlighting research experiences becomes important, or internships or extracurricular experiences that kind of align with your interest area that you're going with in the application can be a really nice way of showing how you've explored your interest in different spaces and different capacities. Thinking about how your experiences have prepared you for this particular kind of graduate program selection that you're going with in the application, demonstrating that that commitment is important. And as I mentioned, it is curating your experience, drawing the reader's attention to what's important about your candidacy.
Can I jump in with one thing, Laura?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, I know all of that said, I want to step back just for a second and underscore the idea that resumes are almost kind of like statements. They are, they speak to an audience. So I think that in our sort of like common, discussion about career preparedness or fellowship application, we think of this resume as one thing. And I think that as you kind of move forward in your, final academic year, or you're moving into the professional space and beyond, finding a place that you have like a resume that contains it all, and maybe in different ways, and keeping that in kind of one spot, but then curating that for the purpose of the audience that you're speaking to. And so what you're going to be doing in terms of putting your resume together for internal nomination might indeed look a little different than a final resume that would go out to a particular fellowship, although they're probably going to be quite similar. So in the context of getting ready for internal nomination, it is really important to think about the decisions you make and how you characterize your experiences and what goes on there in what order, because this is actually a really key document in helping us understand your fit for a fellowship. So that means it's a really important document in addition to the written pieces for like getting nomination. And like thinking about that as a really important source document for credentialing yourself to communicate to the committee all of the things that you have that could be of potential use for developing a persuasive candidacy post-nomination.
Mm-hmm.
It's everything Laura just said, but I'm talking about like, remember, if you're really thinking about endorsement, then like thinking about what you're putting there as it communicates to the endorsement committee about your preparedness for the Rhodes or the Marshall.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point to distinguish, like the resumes we're talking about for fellowship applications is just one variation of how you might think about the resumes that you have, is one version of that, according to what the fellowships are looking for. Okay, so with organization, for professional resumes for work experience, you might have like the more professional types of headings, you know, like the professional experience, extracurriculars or additional information, that kind of thing. For fellowships, once again, understanding what they're looking for, the criteria of the fellowship might influence the thematic groupings that you have in your resume. So thinking about things like leadership or research experience might be a great way of, once again, drawing your reader's attention to the ways in which you fulfill those aspects of the criteria. I think it's also important to note that not everyone's resume is going to look the same. So you might have different kinds of thematic groupings that make sense for you, that fit with what the fellowship is looking for, and other people might be stronger in other ways and highlight different aspects of their experience. But playing around with the groupings and not feeling like you need to be constrained by kind of the traditional job headings that you would see in a, like kind of a professional job application.
So a lot of common subheaders that we see that may not be on all working professional resumes could be, you know, pulling out research, publications, and presentations as its own sort of subheading because you're applying for an academic opportunity, especially if you have enough information to substantiate a couple of bullet points to sort of showcase like, hey, I have had scholarly experience. Here are the ways in which I have, you know, formidably developed research skills. There's also oftentimes an awards or fellowship, other fellowships honors section. If you have, I mean, you never want to have a bullet point where you have like 1 point, right? Like you kind of want to think about the clustering, but if you have ways to showcase like achievements or distinctions, that could be a subheading. And we've also seen like leadership type, I mean, leadership's sort of, um,
It's vague.
it's
I
a
mean,
vague thing, but we've seen sort of like, or community engagement, if you're really involved in sort of like volunteerism, things like that. Oftentimes what we don't see, and if we do see it, it's subordinate to other sections, is professional experience. Because in some ways you're applying for an academic experience that's going to help you for a professional experience. So while there may be like work related or professional experiences, they're not often kind of the leading thing, and they may be subordinate to more academic or distinction type subheaders.
yeah, and I think the emphasis on like under the leadership heading can mean different things.
Yeah.
So I think when we say like leadership, we're thinking about like impact orientation. So not just like I was the treasurer of
Yeah. Not. Mm-hmm.
the, I don't know, coffee club. That's not really leadership as we're thinking about it. Leadership in terms of, you know, working on something that influences a community that has some sort of like greater impact. That'd be the way that we think about leadership. I mean, that's the same way we think about leadership for these fellowship applications as well. I mean, these are also things that we can talk through you as your advisors as you are approaching the internal application. Okay. So some of the do's, I mean, there are many do's and don'ts. So these are just a few of the ones that came to mind as being ones that would be particularly important to focus on. So first of all, being concise. Generally, I say no more than 3 bullet points per experience, because when you get to the point of having 10, just like it that reflects to me that you haven't spent enough time thinking about what are the main aspects about this experience that are important to highlight. So being selective and strategic about what to include in maximizing the space that you do have. As I mentioned earlier, you don't want the most important aspects of your impact, aspects of your responsibility to get lost in like a text dump of things. So you are helping the reader understand your accomplishments and not just giving them tons of information to have to sift through to figure out what they should be taking away. And honestly, the reader will not spend that much time trying to understand what you have. So that's why you want to present that information as nicely and concisely as possible for the reader. Getting specific. So constantly when I review resumes, people write things like, researched and wrote paper on blah. I'm like, okay, well, what was it on? What was it used for? Who was the readership? Like, I want to know the kind of like what, how, why types of questions. So what it was, like how it was used, what the result was, what the impact was. So things like organized a conference. I'm like, well, how many people attended the conference? What did the conference focus on? Like those kinds of questions. So always as you are figuring out what the takeaways are from different experiences, ask yourself those questions and try and provide that kind of context for the reader.
I think a
Using
good litmus test for this, Laura, sorry,
Go ahead.
like
Yeah.
if you have something that could be on anybody's resume, you know, then it's not specific enough, it's not detailed enough. So if it's like research and wrote, you know, white papers for, you know, company, that could be on anybody's resume. Like find a way to bring out a specific or two that could not be on anybody's resume characterizing any other thing than that you did in that role.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that's just replacing kind of like informal or like nominal nouns with proper nouns. So that sometimes helps. Like instead of saying like research for a publication, research for XYZ journal, like the
Mm-hmm.
proper noun helps.
Mm-hmm. Because those are the details that people are going to remember anyway. Otherwise, you just get lost in the mix. Using active verbs is really, really, really critically important. I can't tell you the number of times I've seen helped or participated in on people's resumes. Helped doesn't actually tell me anything. I want to know, okay, you helped, you contributed in some way by helping. What was the nature of your contributions, and focus on that. Wellesley College has a really great handout on active verbs that I love using. It divides them up into like thematic categories. So I would encourage you just to like Google Wellesley College active verbs list, and I think it's like multiple pages. So that's a good starting point to think about, okay, are these kind of like leadership verbs? Are these organizational verbs? And it'll give you verbs to work with. But the active verbs are also going to get more precise about the nature of your contributions and impact anyway, which is also why they're so important.
And I think variety too, like you might have found a good verb, you're not going to use it 7 times, you know, like maybe you get twice on the same verb.
Mm-hmm. And also it will, and this is going to get into like the don'ts, I'm jumping the gun here, but also prevent you from using like adjectives that become a bit ridiculous. Because like a word like spearheaded also like tells me a lot about your initiative, besides you being like masterfully assessed the landscape and did something. So active verbs can help you get more precise in your writing. And then finally, edit and proofread. So as Lauren was saying too, like the resume is an important aspect of your candidacy, of your argument. So you need to be taking just as much care with the resume as you would with an essay response. Because if someone sees grammatical errors or issues with your resume, that's just a reason for them not to really consider you. You don't want to give the reader a reason not to pay close attention to your candidacy. So seek feedback. We are happy, as I said, to provide feedback to you on your resume moving forward. Also mention that the Colley Career Center has a number of different kinds of resume checklists of things to be thinking about. And they also do include sample templates depending upon what kind of opportunities you are pursuing. So I think they have one that does include a leadership section, and they have like the more traditional resumes. So just be good to take advantage of that resource that the Colley Career Center provides. Okay. So the don'ts, some things on our mind. The weak verbs, I kind of already mentioned this, help to participate doesn't tell us anything about the specifics of what you contributed. Don't be redundant. I've seen resumes that provide lots of content that could be found elsewhere. So like, for instance, lists of courses that you've taken. I mean, sometimes people feel tempted to do like the relevant coursework, which could work in certain circumstances, but don't just do kind of like a dump of all the courses that you've taken in your major. That would be found on your transcript, and there's no need for that to appear on your resume. You want to maximize the space that you have in your resume to focus on your experiences and achievements, once again, as they relate to kind of your issue area and the graduate programs you're pursuing. Don't get crazy. Don't go off the wall with crazy fonts. This is not the place to be using, I don't even know.
Comic Sans.
Comic Sans is just a ridiculous font to begin with, but yeah.
It is ridiculous.
As I say that, as I've done different fonts in here. Yeah,
it's a different genre. This is not a resume.
Different genre. I know this is a presentation. do we have someone who's asking us questions? Okay, I'll get to this. So don't get crazy with formatting. Don't use a font size below 10-point font. Also, what it says to me, if you are trying to use like 8-point or 9-point font, is once again, you haven't taken the time to really reflect on your experiences and figure out what's important to highlight. So, 11-point font, 12-point font is perfect place to be in. Don't use margins narrower than 0.5. The objective statements. Okay, so in some contexts, objective or mission statements, that appear at the top of the resume of like diligent student, and actually I don't even like those kinds of things, but like diligent student seeking international relations opportunity. No, not for a resume for a fellowship application. Your other materials are going to forward the narrative about who you are and what you're seeking to do. So the objective statement should not be appearing on your resume for a fellowship application. As I mentioned, avoid the adjectives like including brilliantly did something, expertly did something. No one's going to actually take your word for it. The nature of your responsibility is going to speak for itself, and also your recommenders are going to be the ones who are going to speak to your achievements and abilities. So leave that to your recommenders. And then finally, this is obvious, I think, but don't inflate or embellish your achievements. Try and oversell your contributions when they aren't actually yours. So make sure that it is an honest and accurate reflection of what you've done, because you also don't want the resume to be at odds with kind of what the recommenders are speaking to as well. So the resume is part of a coherent whole that, once again, you want to reflect a polished version of your candidacy and honest and accurate reflection of who you are. So I got a question about, is it okay to highlight research done for a course that relates to your goals or future research? Yes, so if you did like a independent research project, that might appear under, if you had a research section, that might appear under a research section, or potentially, depending on how much you have to work with, so if you had research experience, but you didn't have perhaps enough, and Lauren, you may have a different perspective on this, but you didn't have enough to merit having its own research section, that could potentially appear under like kind of the Georgetown bachelor's in anthropology section. It could be, your honors thesis appears there. So it kind of, I think, depends upon the larger picture of your candidacy. But yes, having done a substantive, like semester-long research project for a course would certainly merit, I think, appearing on a resume in some place.
Yeah, I'll give you an example that actually literally happened today. So I was meeting with someone about a Fulbright who was trying to figure out whether they wanted to do like a study award or a research award. And so she sent me her resume and I was looking at it. And I was like, well, I don't know if you don't really have past research experience. So generally speaking, like those that are coming to the process for a research grant are bringing a little bit of a background in how research is conducted. And I go on and on and on about like whatever. And then she's like, well, actually I do. When I was studying abroad, I did, part of that was an independent study where I designed my own ethnographic like methodologies for interviewing migrant workers. And I'm like, well, okay, that's substantive. She's like, well, it wasn't independent, really. It was part of a coursework and it wasn't a research. It was nowhere on the resume. And like, you leave that out, that's huge. So you also, that's what we mean by like knowing your audience. If you're applying for, like some analyst position, I mean, you could even argue that's important for an analyst position because it's an analytic skill set. But like I could find a way to say like, okay, for some professional opportunities, maybe that research experience isn't important being explicated, but it's certainly those kind of things for an academic leadership opportunity, you want to be able to pull that out and highlight those things. That said, back to the don't overinflate your achievements. If you wrote like a 5-page paper, because that's what was required for the final, like we don't need for you to put like wrote a 5-page paper on like, a lit review. Like, okay, no. But so there's nuance, and that's why this isn't an exact science in a way.
Yeah, actually, I've had that happen multiple times too, talking about independent research grants for Fulbright, when it looks like no one had any independent research or research experience, and it turns out they're like, oh, actually, I did. I had, 2 years worth of different research done. So yes, to echo that. Okay. Any other questions about this so far? I mean, I guess we can also take questions at the end, but let's move on. Just to demystify the differences between a resume and a CV. A CV is generally going to be is going to be more of like an academic resume, so to speak. What your professors and graduate students in your department have would be a CV reflecting the nature of their kind of research experiences and awards. A resume is going to be like the shorter version, like 1 page, no more than like 2 page statement, whereas a CV could be, I mean, a professor could have a CV that's like 30 pages long. More kind of like an exhaustive overview of their academic profile. So in these contexts, we're pretty much like talking about a resume, and once again, it goes back to the curation and selection of your activities to include on the resume. If you wanted examples of what a CV looks like, I mean, faculty post links to their CVs all the time on departmental pages, so you can also take a look at that. I don't think I have anything else to say about this.
Outside of the academy, if you're like pursuing scholarly work, there's really not a lot of use for a CV.
Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna get an example resume sample here of, I think, a well-organized resume. So here as we mentioned previously, like you could have, I think, or Lauren mentioned, like an award section. So this one does have an award section highlighting the nature of kind of their intellectual and academic contributions, which once again, for the purposes of a fellowship, like say the Marshall, is I think an important thing. So here honors, like, you know, the kind of like, if it was like Phi Beta Kappa or that kind of thing, would appear under like the bachelor degree. Oh, something also, I didn't mention this, I think you should always be using months and years. I don't like when people put like fall of 2018 to spring of 2019, because that could either be like 1 month. It could be either mean that you did something from like December of 2018 to January of 2019, or it could mean that you did something for like 8 months, and there's a huge difference. So in terms of being precise, I would always encourage you to use the month and year option. But here, getting into like the active verbs: designed and executed an independent research project exploring discourses of blindness within Christianity, is giving me a sense of like what exactly they did, what it entailed. Planned and executed an independent research project on deaf education in Jordan using participant observations and interviews, and authored 40-page ethnography. So it's not just like authored an ethnography, authored a 40-page ethnography. So like these kind of details matter in highlighting, once again, the substance of what you were doing.
Yeah, one thing I want to just point out, I don't know if this is maybe on a later slide, but you will notice here how the structure is set up for like symmetry in institution, role, and then activities related to that role. And that it kind of like aligns from left to right. And every time you drop down to offer a new thematic element, you take it out by a few spaces so that you have like the way the eye works. This actually helps someone read a resume fairly quickly, because sometimes people just want to know about the institutions. Sometimes people just want to know about the role. And this allows for like really quick readability. And your subheaders, like making those distinct from the other component parts by like either capitalizing them or bolding them, but look at the difference in use so that a lot of information can be absorbed quite quickly based on the like formatting.
Yeah, and I actually really like, I mean, this is how I like resumes. I mean, you can do it different ways, but I love when there's kind of like the line across. I think it just like, once again, helping
Right.
organize the content for the reader. I like the look of that.
Yeah.
It's very clean. So just continuing on, and here, like, once again, like what that research experience might look like. I don't know if there's like that much to comment on this. Once again, besides using, maybe I should zoom in. Do I need to zoom in here?
Oh, who you've been doing research for. So if there's someone that you're not just a research assistant at a center, but you're probably working with a scholar. And in the field, like as people look at you for credentials, they're also looking at who you're working with and for. That becomes important in establishing your own sort of sense of like, are you in touch with where things are moving and shaking in your space? So especially also if you're going to do a thesis and that's being mentored by a faculty member, listing that faculty member's name, like, supervised by XYZ, that kind of stuff is helpful.
Mm-hmm. And also language skills should always appear on your resume. Sometimes people haven't included languages on their resume, and I think, oh my goodness, like that's such an amazing skill set that should definitely appear. So make sure that if you do have any language skills, that would be something that's important to include in your resume as well. For the purposes of this kind of thing, given that you don't have much space, I don't know if like writing that you love traveling is the most, the kind of like additional information hobby section about like love traveling and cooking. Once again, if we think about like putting forward materials that are going to most distinguish you, that's probably not important content to include. Maybe if you were a pole jumper, that might be interesting. But the more generic kinds of interests, probably not maximizing the space that you have to include those kinds of things.
Yeah, if you do that thing around personal stuff, and I'm kind of like hit and miss on that. What it's always missed for me when it is like, yeah, every third person does that, right? So like, okay, yes, we're all in COVID, we're all baking. Like now that you've become your own, baker at your home, like it's not as exciting as like if you have. Oh, also I think it's kind of strange though, but musical or sporting type stuff for the roads can, even though that's not required, it can still be a part of the factor of like excellence in many spaces. So I think that there could be for the roads in Marshall, a particularly interesting, if you have space, like personal interests, hobbies, or I guess there's probably a better word for that. Because sometimes when everything is the same, it's weird how people are influenced. And sometimes that you saw someone did pole vaulting and you did pole vaulting, you like love them more than you did before you saw
Well,
that.
that's unique and quirky. I mean, it's not like writing like
Yes,
traveling.
exactly.
So yeah, if they're quirky hobbies that distinguish you, those are definitely conversation starters. People like quirks. I mean, so to a certain degree, I mean, let's be probably being careful, I don't know, careful about what appears there. But yeah, those kinds of things are definitely something where you're reading someone's resume, you're impressed by their kinds of experiences, and you get to like,
I know you're fun and you do weird
yeah,
things.
you're like, oh, that's kind of a cool thing. And those kinds of things sometimes appear, come up in interviews. People are
And
like,
if
oh,
you're on varsity sport too.
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, like if you're like maintaining your grades and research and all that, and you're out there like practicing and participating and on the road, I think that again talks about like to attest to like a, skill in terms of managing a lot of things and whatever. So that those sorts of things can be helpful, even though they may not necessarily be like directly related to the thing and more of a
yeah.
personal
Yeah,
character.
though I wouldn't put like bocce ball enthusiast on my resume unless I was actually competing in bocce ball. So like, I mean, there's some things here that
You can't just
uh,
pick up a quirky hobby just
yeah, you can't
because.
just pick up a quirky hobby. Though that would be kind of a cool thing.
We might test you.
My bocce ball
No,
enthusiasm.
I'm
Yeah.
saying like anybody that puts it on their resume to get endorsement, we're like, you get endorsement, but we need to see if you actually can do, you know, cornhole like you said you could.
Yeah, which I guess gets into the kind of some Helen asked about what words, conventions, phrases do you recommend for assessing language skills?
Mm.
Um, I don't know if
I
like you're in
think
the SFS. Sorry, go ahead, Lauren.
no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say like the SFS proficiency exam. I mean, you can kind of use like how you were evaluated if you achieved proficiency in SFS, like proficiency exam. You could indicate like Mandarin and then do in parentheses like School for Foreign Service proficiency or proficiency in Mandarin and then in parentheses like School for Foreign Service proficiency exam or something. I would just be very careful about like sometimes a couple times I've seen people write like professional working or what's the phrase? Professional proficiency or something. Is that the phrase in Spanish? And that actually means like if you were actually able to function in a workplace environment using that language. So you have to be very careful about that phrasing.
And I mean, I think most people have a sense of whether they're beginner, intermediate, or advanced,
Yeah.
which I think are common ways that we see language self-evaluated on resumes. So, I mean, like whatever you put, just be prepared to have like, have a reason why. Oh, well, I am intermediate because I've had, 3 semesters or 4 semesters of this level language or something, right? So,
And whatever course you're in at like Georgetown, if you're in the beginner of Arabic,
That's
then
probably, and you're in a beginner. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
right, yeah. So it kind of comes down to that too. Yeah, so just kind of, I think using, I think common sense probably with like regards to that, just making sure once again you're not inflating your language skills, and then someone like wants to engage. I don't think this would happen, but
Yeah.
you never know. Someone decides to speak to you in Mandarin, and when you put down you were advanced in Mandarin, actually you're more basic. That would be a problem. So yeah, so according to what you think you are, what courses you are currently in would probably influence that decision. Okay, so that's basically what I had. Lauren, I don't know if you had any other kinds of important points you want to make. Otherwise, if other people have questions, we can address. Oh, what happened to the picture here?
I think the only oh, bummer. I think the only thing that we might have like skirted around has to do with length, but maybe we didn't actually, explain all the way that you either go one full entire page or two
Oh,
full entire pages, not 1.5 or 1 3/4 or 2 1/4. And then always PDF and review, because sometimes with the doc, like it drops into a second page or you lose that line. So I think kind of like just making sure that, like maybe you have a 1.25 pages, you can shrink the font by half a size and everything shrinks up. So you have to play sometimes with the formatting so that it kind of contains like itself within the expected bounds where it kind of fully, fills a page or two.
since this is a live document, I'm just going to add that 1 or 2. Oops, let me throw it over here.
And now we can do questions if, I guess that's all I had.
Any other questions?
Yeah, and we only have a few people, so you should feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah.
I'll stop the recording now though, so